Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. In this episode, I meet veteran retail consultant Darrell Rigby, partner and director at Bain Company. We talk about his new book, Doing Agile Right. We explore decades of experience advising C-level executives on making their organizations nimble and get his take on the retail in the COVID era, the lessons retailers can and should be taking away from their experiences. Let's listen in. Darrell, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
Oh, Michael, I'm terrific. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining me. I'm excited to delve into this topic. I mean, and we're going to look at your book, and we're going to look at your background. Your book is Doing Agile Right. And I was saying to a counterpart yesterday, with the COVID crisis, if Agile didn't exist, we would have needed to invent it. So I think, the timing is fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. Why don't we jump right in? Tell us first a little bit about yourself, your background, personal, professional journey, and what you do now at Bain & Co.
Great. So let's see. I'm a Southern California kid. I grew up on the beaches around Huntington Beach and Newport Beach in Southern California. And I came back east to Boston to go to business school, and I have stayed here ever since. I never left. I worked as a summer associate at Bain Company in 1977, so I guess I've been with Bain for 43 years now. I led Bain's global retail practice for 26 years. And then about 15 years ago, I founded and now lead Bain's global innovation practice and our Agile practice.
It's fantastic background. I mean, as I said, I'm so looking forward to the conversation. Tell us a little bit about Bain & Company. I think I know a bit about it, but I always find, particularly since you've been there for 40 years, you've got a depth of ability to explain kind of the scope and the scale and where you guys focus your time and where you put all your efforts into.
Great, thank you. I love Bain & Company. Bain was founded in 1973, so it was about 4 years old and maybe 50 people when I joined.
Wow.
Now over 10,000, I'm sure. And we're a general management consulting firm with a heavy emphasis on strategy and especially growth strategies, but serving all industries and a wide variety of functional capabilities as well.
Now, is there a private equity practice that it's separate? Or am I getting those two things mixed up? Is that a part of or a separate thing?
Well, so Bain has gone through a number of pivots, a number of transformations over time as well. And back in 1983, Bill Bain, the founder of the company, said, we think we are better than any other consulting firm in the world. And we're creating greater results than anybody. So as opposed to just selling those results to clients, what if we created them for ourselves? And so Bill Bain set up Bain Capital. It didn't take long for the lawyers to say, you can't have those in the same company. You're going to run into conflicts of interest. So we ended up spinning out Bain Capital, kept the name Bain, but Bain Capital is quite separate from Bain & Company now, but they have common roots and they use Bain's approaches and our services frequently also.
All right. Well, thanks for unpacking that. I sometimes get a bit confused. So that's
you are not
I
alone.
can end the podcast now. I mean, that's one of my biggest questions all the time. All right. Let's talk about your new book, Doing Agile Right. Came out in the summer, I believe, right? So new as in this year. It's not your first book. And it, when I was looking at it, I was reading the summary, the first question that popped into my mind was, okay, if your book is about doing Agile right, clearly there may be some folks who are not doing it right or maybe room for improvement. But talk about the book in general in terms of why you felt the need to write the book. I mean, was there, so to speak, white space on the shelf where there's an absence of thought leadership aligned to this, or what told you that this was something that the market needed and that would be valuable in the context of the practice?
Yes, thank you for asking. And I should start by saying I did not want to write a book. I never intended to write a book. But just to back up a little bit and tell you where I got interested in Agile was it was a little over 15 years ago when I was working with retailers on what we were calling omni-channel strategies. That is, how do you bring to bear the best of digital and physical assets to succeed in this new world? And as I was doing that, I had to work much more closely with the technology departments of retailers. And as I was doing that, they were using a language that befuddled me. I could not make heads or tails of it. There were sprints and there were backlogs and retrospectives, and it seemed to me like a language I did not want to learn. So I began by using our technology experts to interpret what these people were saying to me. But it didn't take long for me to realize that the retailers that were the most effective and the fastest at making the transition to truly integrated retailing were those that were using Agile in their technology departments. And so I thought, I can't put this off any longer. I've got to learn how this works. So I started taking training classes so that I could get certified in Agile principles and practices. I read books, but most importantly, I started sitting in on the meetings, on the collaboration teams that were working in Agile ways. And the longer I sat in those, the longer I watched how effective they were and how much more fun people were having, I said, this is not a technology. This is a better way of doing innovation. And so I think the contributions that I've made to the Agile community were taking it far beyond technology into all aspects of innovation in retailers to start with, but now many, many other industries. And eventually saying, if we can make teams this adaptive, this agile, what if we could do that for an entire business unit? Or what if we could do that for the entire corporation? I became passionate about it. I found myself changing my own approach to managing teams and managing client engagements.
Tell me a little bit about the history. Where did Agile, where did that originate from? I mean, when I graduated from school, it was deep into the, following the Japanese manufacturing processes like Kaizen, and we remember reading all those books where there is a whole philosophy of how to be great manufacturers. Where did Agile come from? You discovered it in IT groups, but what's its genesis?
Yeah, great question. Because interestingly enough, a lot of people think it came from technology, but actually, the first article that some people will trace Agile all the way back to Sir Francis Bacon and the scientific method in 1620. That's probably a little long, but we do see these plan, do, check, act cycles in the 40s and the 50s. And the first article that I saw on this was in 1986 by a couple of professors in Japan that had written an article in the Harvard Business Review called the New Product Development Process. And they had noticed that there were a lot of companies like Canon making cameras and Honda making engines and Fuji making copiers, and they were doing it in a different way. They weren't doing it in what gets called a waterfall process, or what they called a relay race, where one group sees a need and the next group does the specifications and another group does design and another group does development, where it just gets passed along like an assembly line. These people were moving the projects forward more like a rugby team, passing the ball back and forth as they moved it upfield. And so they talked about the difference between a relay race and a rugby game. Well, during the early 90s, when the internet took off, a lot of people, a lot of software developers were looking for better ways to quickly develop and release software. One of those was a friend of mine, a fellow named Jeff Sutherland, and he was the co-inventor of a process called Scrum. He named that after reading this article to honor the rugby approach.
I never connected those two before.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Fantastic.
So that's the history, and it really took hold quickly in software, but now it's gone, of course, way beyond software.
Yeah, it's really, as I said, a philosophy. Tell us about the book itself and the central thesis or purpose. For those, many I think would know the term, but not necessarily the discipline. And so, kind of a two-part question. One is what is the book, and what's your purpose for the book itself, other than to fill this knowledge gap that I think you saw existed, and then broaden the conversation, and then explain Agile and the core principles itself for those listeners who may not be as familiar.
Good, thank you. I'm glad you asked this question, because often when I'm talking to executives about Agile, I feel like Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride saying, "You keep using that term. I don't think you know what that means. What you think it means." And
but you're probably not. You're probably a little bit weary of saying you don't know what it means. So that's my job. I get to ask that question.
Well, it's the reason that we called it Doing Agile Right, is because we feel so passionately about it, and yet we see a lot of Agile done wrong. And so that's actually the reason we wrote the book. Is I think a lot of people are hijacking the term. Sometimes it's beginning to mean quick layoffs. Let's get rid of 30% of our people and call it Agile. Or sometimes people are using it as just another club to say, when I say Agile, it means you do what I say faster than you were before. And none of those, of course, are correct, but it often gets abused. So what Agile really means, Agile is just a better way of doing innovation through deep and continuous collaboration with customers and continuous testing and learning. And so, as opposed to what happens with a lot of innovations, where people will do extensive market research up front, and then they'll use that research to say, aha, I know what we should develop. And here are the product specifications and the features. Now go away and develop it. And 2 years later, people will come back with the answer to those specifications, and yet we know 70 to 90% of innovations fail. And why do they fail? They fail because they developed the wrong thing, either because they didn't really understand up front what customers wanted, or because during that 2-year period of time, customers had changed. And so, yes, you delivered on time and on spec what you promised to deliver, but customers don't want it anymore. And then the second problem is that people are developing things that when it's given to operations to adopt and scale, that operation says, we can't make this. Where did you get this idea?
We can't make 1,000 of those. We can make one of them.
Exactly.
We could do one store like that. We can't do the chain like that.
That's exactly right. And so Agile is just a way of getting multifunctional, cross-organizational silos to collaborate together and to stay very close to customers the whole way along. And every roughly 2 weeks, we're taking a prototype, a real working prototype of some part of this innovation, putting it in front of customers, getting their feedback while it's early enough to change what they don't like. And it turns out that the earlier that you can get a prototype in front of customers, the more valuable it is for a couple of reasons. One is customers are better at giving you feedback because it's early enough that they're going to play with it in unexpected ways and say, oh, what I'd really like is this, or I know I told you this, but I don't like it now that I see it.
Right. I said I wanted that, but now that you've given it to me, I didn't really want that after all.
Exactly.
Right?
And if an inventor or if an innovator has only played with this for 2 weeks, they're much more open to that feedback than they are if they've been working on it for a year and they're listening to what the customers say and saying, well, I know what they're saying. They're saying they don't really like it, but I think what they mean is they'll get used to it over time. And so it's just a process of setting out hypotheses and asking yourself, how could I test those as quickly and effectively as possible? And then building those in and moving on to the next features and releasing things so that they get much faster time to value.
And I guess wrapped up in that or nested in that is things like the minimal viable product idea that get it to a point where it's at least good enough. It's not perfect. And then, I have to reflect on things like, in our current context, I want to talk about your thoughts about how COVID has made this an imperative, I think, for retailers is, things like curbside, right? Where retailers are like, I want to be perfect at it. I don't want to do anything that isn't a flawless execution, but something like COVID comes along and you now have, instead of 2 curbside orders, 200 to do, and you better figure out a minimal viable product. Is that a central theme in your mind to the Agile process, or am I simplifying it a bit too much?
No, I don't think you're simplifying it too much at all. I think necessity is the mother of invention. And actually, a number of my retail clients were forced to move on that in Canada first because they really had no choice, either shut down or figure out how to do curbside delivery. And, and a lot of them had never really played with curbside delivery because it felt expensive. It felt like, boy, if they don't come into the store, then how am I going to get the cross shopping that I really want? And to tell you the truth, I think they were ignoring something that customers may have been interested in for some time, but never really had the incentive to do it until they were forced to do it. And
I said, I was talking to a radio station yesterday about this whole curbside, and I said, you have to understand, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, that sometimes volume solves sins, so to speak, in retail. In other words, curbside's a bit of a hassle if there's 2 people a day coming, right? Because you're probably pulling an associate off another duty. They're not specialized. Maybe they forget their login and password. That's been in my experience a bit. But now when you're getting 200 to 300 orders, like you're full on adopting, now you can build expertise in a team at it, right? I mean, you think that reflects your experience as well with your clients?
Oh, you're absolutely right. In fact, one of the things that I've noticed is a difference between retailers who say, all right, I got to do curbside delivery. I'll try to string some things together and survive this long enough until we can eliminate it and get customers back in the store. And other retailers that are saying, this could be here to stay. Maybe we are, instead of planning how quickly can we end this, we start figuring out how can we make it better? How can we make it more profitable? How can we differentiate ourselves from the competition to make this a better experience for customers?
It's almost a philosophy or approach as well, because in working with retailers, if they approach it like this is a great way to have e-commerce sales cost effectively because the customers are coming to pick it up, versus this is a cost hit to the enterprise who's not getting a customer in the store. Even the approach at which you take to curbside and thinking about it, let's say philosophically, is pretty meaningful, yeah?
Yes, it is. And I often describe Agile as having 2 components. It has a mindset, that is, there are Agile values and principles that we adhere to, like customer obsession, and everybody in the organization has not just the right, but the responsibility to contribute innovative ideas, and everyone has the opportunity to learn and grow and focus on the things that they do well. So there are Agile mindsets, and then there are Agile methods, the practices that a team will actually use to do that, like constructing a backlog and prioritizing things and avoiding multitasking. And you need both of them. But I think you're exactly right. One of the things that I love about retail, and yet that is challenging about retail, is that it's a complex system. And, there's so much behavioral economics going on in the world today that you don't really know how customers are going to respond to things until you get it out there and let them respond to it. And you learn and you grow. I was fascinated by how Walmart, for example, was developing these robots to go up and down the aisles, to scan the aisles, to look for things that were out of stock and look at shelf stocking. And that's a pretty expensive venture. But as they started doing more pickup from store or ship from store or curbside delivery, they had more employees in the aisles, and they said,
we don't need the robots anymore.
We don't need the robots anymore. Exactly right. So
I was of two minds about that. In one, I use that in my keynote presentations as an example of automation and AI and machine vision. So I was kind of sad to see it go because it was a great example. So I was like, oh, but that's a great decision. But kind of sad to see it go. It teaches us another lesson about technology doesn't necessarily in and of itself solve the problem, right?
Yeah, I think the key, and Agile does this very well, is Agile never tries to develop specific products or features. Agile is always trying to solve a customer problem. Jeff Bezos likes to say customers are always beautifully, wonderfully dissatisfied. There's always something that we can do better to satisfy them. And so I think if you view innovation as something that its real purpose is to solve a customer frustration, and whether we do that with automation or whether we do that with humans, who cares? I love watching these Disney movies that are beautiful combinations of real life actors and animation. And, or even if you go to Disney World, when we're capable of going to Disney World, so many of the rides are combinations of both the best of digital and physical. And
it's an interesting metaphor.
It's what I hope for the future of retail, actually.
We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Veronica Sansev, co-founder of Commerce Next. On behalf of my fellow co-founders, Scott Silverman and Alan Dick, I'd like to invite you to join us for the Commerce Next Marketing Summit Series on January 20th, 27th, and February 3rd. Get 2021 off to a smart start with this virtual conference featuring insights from top executives and e-commerce industry leaders, including Sephora, Wayfair, Untuckit, Red Antler, HBC, The Yes, Cartier, East Bay Champs, FTD, J.Crew, StockX, and many more. Learn more at commercenext.com. Registration is complimentary for retailers and brands. We hope to see you there.
Last question about the book. Then I want to get to some questions about Agile and about retail in general. I can't miss this opportunity to talk with you about just your insights about retail. Is this book, did you intend it to be kind of a beginner's guide, or is it a master class? Like, who should buy this book?
Well, we had in mind intermediates, I would say. We wanted to push beyond how do you run agile teams. There are a lot of guides out there that talk about the specifics of how do you teach the principles and practices of agile teams. There are plenty of those. Sure. What we wanted to do was to say, because right now I have the honor of working with 3 of the companies that I'll bet you would recognize, you would describe as some of the most innovative and agile companies in the world. All of them have more than 2,000 agile teams up and running. 2 of them have more than 3,000 agile teams up and running. But what they're saying is, Darrell, we could launch agile teams. We could launch 100 a month. That's no challenge for us. But what we're finding is that this process of creating an agile business system, the more that we learn about it, the more we realize we're just beginning that process. The more we learn, the more we recognize how little we know. And that's where this book is aimed, not just teaching people how to do agile teams, but how do you build an agile business system, an agile enterprise. And so we were aiming it at executives who sort of think agile is for technology teams. What does this have to do with me? And one of the things that we do find is you can do agile teams at the team level just fine. But unless the senior executive team is on board, you're never really going to create an agile enterprise. So we were aiming it at the C-suite of people that may not understand how it works, but want to create that kind of a company. And we were also writing it for people that are doing agile inside the organization today, but might want to give as a holiday gift this book to their senior executives saying, hey, this is interesting. Take a look at this. Maybe there are some things here we could work on together.
It's a great segue into my last couple of questions. I mean, in this COVID era that we're in, I've had retailers tell me, they stay awake at night thinking about how do I transform an organization that is really oriented towards operational effectiveness, efficiency, making the trains run on time, relentless details into planning and forecasting, and very good at that, into an organization that is nimble. Because, today, the province of Quebec in Canada says no curbside. You're not allowed to do curbside for the next month. And we've never seen these kind of whipsaw decisions. So retailers are, C-suite leaders are realizing they somehow need to transform their organization just to get through COVID, but probably beyond. Is this the right approach in your mind? Is there some middle ground between being really well planned out, which kind of, you need to have your open to buys and you need to forecast, versus being agile? How do you think about that?
Yeah, you're raising a very important question, Michael. And I've worked in retail for so many decades. It's probably my primary love, actually. And yet I'm forced to say that I work in a lot of industries now with innovation and agile. And I find retail organizations to be some of the most bureaucratic. I hate to say that, but there's a sense in retail, there's a phrase that I learned about 40 years ago of retail is detail. Right. And there's this sense that as long as we keep making little things better and better, we'll do okay. And there's also a sense that the senior executives in retail should have all the answers. That's why you're a senior executive, is that you can see the future, and therefore you can create orders, for lack of a better term, of if people will just do this, then we'll be okay. Right. And I really do not believe there's an industry that is better suited to agile ways of working than retail, because with all of the different stores and with all of the online and mobile opportunities that we have, we can test anything in retail. We can test it at a store level. We can test it at a regional level. We can test it online. It is perfect. Agile is just perfect for retail. And I think finally, and I've had several discussions with retail CEOs over the past 6 months, where they're saying, we've learned something during this pandemic. We always thought that in order to become agile, we had to restructure the entire organization, and we had to bring in an entirely new talent pool. Because what happens is if you give people orders all the time, you don't really know what people are capable of doing. You know if they're capable of obeying orders or not, but you don't really know whether they're capable of becoming the kind of general manager that you're going to need in the future. Well, with this COVID pandemic, what they're telling me is we've had no choice but to prioritize more effectively, to innovate more quickly, to trust people more rapidly and earnestly, to let them test and learn and figure out things. And so there are some things that we're very proud of what we've done during this pandemic. On the other hand, it's still a little haphazard and sporadic, and our people, frankly, are pretty burned out. Yeah. So how do we bottle this up? There's some interesting data that even though executives feel like we have never innovated as quickly as we have over the past 7 or 8 months, data from customers say they are less satisfied with retailers during this pandemic than they were before. Often satisfaction scores are dropping by 4+ percentage points, and some retailers by 7 percentage points. So at the same time, we're so proud of the fact that we're getting more innovative. Customers are saying, you're not moving far enough, fast enough to keep me happy. And I think retailers, at least the CEOs I'm talking to, are a little afraid that when this pandemic passes, that people will revert to habitual behaviors, much like a rubber band. And then when the next crisis comes, we're going to have to reinvent this process all over again. So that's what I'm excited to work on, is to say, let's make this more sustainable, more systematic, in a way that makes people happy to continue doing it, and that will help you, because we're seeing real separation from winners versus losers during the
real bifurcation.
Real bifurcation.
Last question for you. It does feel like we're at the beginning of the end of the COVID era. I mean, we've got great news around the world, in North America, Canada, and the U.S. on vaccines. We're not there yet. We're at the beginning of the end. What lessons should retailers start to think about taking away from it? And I ask everyone I can the same question. What do you think is a structural change, whether it's consumers or retailers, and what do you think is just an adaptation? For example, this massive increase of e-commerce in the grocery sector. When stores open again, I imagine people will go back to shopping in stores, not the same amount. So that's one of the things that's been mentioned to me. But other things I think may be more structural and changed. I rarely say this. You probably rarely say this. 40 years of consulting, this changes everything. But is there anything that in your mind is changed that won't be the same post-COVID, post-vaccine?
There are a few things that I hope will change. One is, I think a lot of executives, not just retail executives, I think a lot of executives tend to think in straight line trends. Therefore, I can just extrapolate what's happened in the last 6 months and pull out my ruler and say, oh, well, then I see what it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years. And if there's one thing that I've learned working in retail, it is that the world moves in cycles. And some of them are big swings, some of them are small, some of them,
sometimes you pivot 360 degrees back to where you started, right?
That's exactly right. I am old enough, my friend, that if you were to go look in my closet, you would see a wide variety of styles that I know are going to come back around
again. Keep those wide ties, Darrell. Keep those wide ties.
Exactly.
You're going to need them.
I'm not going to throw those babies away. So I hope people are realizing that we just can't predict the way we thought we could predict what's going to be happening. I often am bemused by people that are doing 5 and 10-year plans. I agree that it's useful to have a North Star that we start to head towards, but adaptive plans have to be a part of that. Don't waste too much time trying to predict the unpredictable. And I just see so many retailers wasting so much time on their annual and 3-year budgeting plans. I watched it last year where they spent 6 months doing it, and then by March it was all thrown out the window.
Yeah. So by March you were either hit with a sledgehammer or a shockwave, depending on who you were.
Exactly.
You're facing a liquidity crisis one week, and then the next week you're like, "This could be our record year for us." Like, it's just bananas. Right?
Exactly.
Listen, I think. Through the book and through this conversation, such a valuable contribution to the dialogue of what's happening in retail and the thought leadership. And so I wanted to thank you for being on the podcast and joining me and having this kind of wide-ranging discussion. I guess super last question, where can people get a hold of the book? Usual places, I would suspect, but tell us a bit about that.
Yes. Well, originally we expected the biggest selling channel to be airport bookstores.
How'd that work out?
That didn't work out so well. We had to adapt. We had to pivot. So a lot of people are picking it up online through either a local bookseller or through Amazon is probably the easiest way to do it.
And Chapters as well in Canada. Chapters.
Exactly. Yes.
I keep calling them Chapters. They're showing my age there. Listen, Darrell, thanks again for joining me here on The Voice of Retail. It was a great conversation, and I wish you continued success and continued interest in advocating for Agile. And let's see how it rolls out in retail over the next period of time.
Michael, such a pleasure to be with you. I'm honored to be included in your program. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks to Darrell for being my guest on this episode. Today's podcast represents the next evolution of The Voice of Retail. In 2021, I'm moving to mostly single interviews of retail leaders and retail industry insiders twice a week, with new episodes debuting Mondays and Fridays. If you like this podcast, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Podcast, or your favorite podcast platform, rate and review, and be sure to recommend to a friend or colleague in the retail industry. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, founder and president of ME LeBlanc Company, Inc. You can learn more about me on www.meleblanc.co or, of course, on LinkedIn. Until next time, have a safe week.